The galaxy whispered her name in hushed tones. Zarathik of the Veltar. Even the bravest space traders would lower their voices when speaking of her. She stood 7 feet tall, with crimson skin marked by the ritual scars of her people.
For
15 long years, she had been passed from one owner to another across the Dominion Empire. Yet her reputation grew with each transfer. The stories spread like wildfire through space stations and trading posts. 17 escape attempts.
us.
12 successful revolts that freed hundreds of her fellow prisoners.
Us.
Over 300 guards who never returned home to their families.
Bit.
But these weren't just numbers in a report. Each incident had become a legend. Of its own, there was the time on Rigel Station, when she single-handedly disabled the entire security system using nothing but scrap metal and determination. Or the famous breakout from the Titan mining complex, where she led 2,000 prisoners to freedom before disappearing into the asteroid fields. The Empire's most wanted lists always featured her image, but somehow she was never found until she wanted to be. Now she found herself in the worst place possible. The maximum security mining facility on Kepler 442b was designed for prisoners like her. The planet itself was a nightmare of endless tunnels and crushing gravity. Here, in the deepest levels, she worked the dilithium mines under constant watch. Her current owner, Baron Vextar, had spent more money on containing her than most people would see in a lifetime. The neural inhibitors wrapped around her skull would send waves of pain through her body at the first sign of disobedience. The gravity shackles on her wrists and ankles made her feel like she was carrying 3 times her own weight. But worst of all was the collar around her neck. It didn't just monitor her heartbeat and breathing. It could read her thoughts. Every morning, she would wake up on the cold metal floor of her cell and feel the weight of 15 years pressing down on her. The scars on her arms told the story of her people's suffering. The Veltar had once been a proud warrior race with their own planets and cities. Now, they were scattered across the galaxy, working in mines and factories, building the empire that had destroyed their world. But Zarathik was different. Where others had accepted their fate, she had never stopped fighting. Every day in the mines, she would study the guards' patterns. She'd memorize the shift changes, the weak points in the security systems, the layout of every tunnel and ventilation shaft. Her mind was a weapon that no collar could fully control. The other prisoners looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope. They had heard the stories too. Some whispered that she was planning another escape. Others said she was waiting for the right moment to strike back at the Empire itself. But Zarathik kept her thoughts to herself. She had learned that hope could be more dangerous than any weapon. Meanwhile, in the Outer Rim territories, a human smuggler named Rico Torres was having the worst day of his life. His ship, the Broken Promise, was barely holding together after their last job. The cargo hold was empty. His crew was complaining about late payments, and the Imperial patrols were getting more aggressive by the day. Rico wasn't like most humans in this galaxy. He hadn't been born in the wealthy core worlds with their clean cities and easy lives. He grew up on a frontier planet where survival meant making hard choices. His parents had been farmers until the Empire decided their land was needed for a military base. They never saw a single credit in compensation. That experience had shaped everything about Rico. He hated bullies, whether they wore Imperial uniforms or expensive suits. His smuggling operation wasn't just about making money. For years, he had been quietly helping people escape from situations they couldn't handle alone. Nothing too dangerous, just small jobs that his conscience wouldn't let him ignore. But today was different. A message had arrived on his private channel, encrypted with codes that only one person knew. His old mentor, Captain Blake Morrison, was dying on a medical station 3 systems away. The message was brief but urgent. The most dangerous prisoner in the galaxy holds the key to preventing a catastrophe. Find her before it's too late. Rico stared at the message for a long time. Blake had never been one for dramatics, he said. Something was important. It usually was. But this felt different, bigger. The kind of job that could either make a person rich or get them killed. The coordinates in the message, a Kepler 4 for 2B. Rico knew the planet's reputation. It was where the Empire sent prisoners who were too dangerous to keep anywhere else. Getting someone out of there wouldn't just be difficult, it would be impossible. He spent 3 days researching the facility's security systems. The mining complex was built into the planet's core, with only one way in and out. The guards were the Empire's best, equipped with weapons that could stop a small army. The prisoners were kept in separate sections, monitored by artificial intelligence that never slept. But Rico had advantages that most people didn't know about. His years of smuggling had taught him how to forge documents, hack communication systems, and move through Imperial space without being detected. More importantly, he had contacts in places where most people couldn't even imagine. One of those contacts was a maintenance worker named Dex, who had been servicing the mining facility for 2 years. Dex owed Rico a favor from an old job, and favors were the closest thing to currency in the Outer Rim. Through Dex, Rico learned about the facility's layout, the guard schedules, and most importantly, the location of the maximum security cells. The plan that formed in Rico's mind was audacious, even by his standards. He would need to create a distraction big enough to draw attention away from the high-security section. Then he would have maybe 10 minutes to reach the target, disable the restraints, and get back to his ship before the entire facility locked down. As he prepared his equipment, Rico couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Blake's message had mentioned preventing a catastrophe, but what kind of catastrophe could one prisoner prevent? And why was she so dangerous that the Empire had built an entire facility just to contain her? The night before his departure, Rico sat in his ship's cockpit looking out at the stars. Tomorrow, he would either save someone who might change the galaxy, or he would die trying. Either way, his life was about to change forever. He activated his ship's navigation system and plotted a course for Kepler 4 to be. The broken promise might not look like much, but she had never failed him when it mattered. Hyperspace. Rico whispered a quiet prayer to whatever gods might be listening. He had no idea that in a cell deep beneath the planet's surface, a crimson-skinned warrior was having the same thought. Both of them were about to discover that some meetings are written in the stars, and some destinies cannot be avoided, no matter how hard you try to run from them. The galaxy was about to change. And it would all begin with a simple act of kindness, from one human to another, being in chains. Rico's plan started exactly at midnight when the facility's main power grid switched to backup systems. He had spent days studying the mining complex's energy patterns, and this 30-second window was his only chance to slip past the outer. Sensors undetected, Broken Promise descended through the planet's toxic atmosphere like a ghost, her engines barely humming. The electromagnetic pulse device in his backpack was homemade, but effective. Rico had learned to build them during his early smuggling days when avoiding Imperial scanners meant the difference between profit and prison. As he attached the device to the facility's main communication array, his hands were surprisingly steady. Years of dangerous work had taught him to push fear aside when it mattered most. The explosion lit up the night sky like a miniature sun. Alarms began blaring throughout the complex as guards rushed toward the destroyed communication tower. Rico smiled grimly as he watched the chaos unfold from his hiding spot behind a supply depot. Phase 1 was complete, but the real challenge was just beginning. Getting inside the facility required more than just technical skill. Rico had forged transport orders claiming he was delivering medical supplies to the infirmary. The documents looked perfect, complete with official seals and authorization codes that Dex had provided. But standing face to face with the guard at the entrance, Rico felt sweat beating on his forehead. "Medical supplies?" the guard asked, scanning the fake documents with his electronic reader. "We weren't expecting any deliveries tonight. Emergency shipment," Rico replied, keeping his voice calm and professional. "There's been an outbreak of solar fever in Sector 7. Your medical staff requested immediate supplies." The guard frowned and checked his communication device, but thanks to Rico's earlier sabotage, he couldn't reach the medical bay for confirmation. After a tense moment, he waved Rico through. Sometimes the best plans were the simplest ones. The corridors inside the facility were a maze of metal and concrete, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that hurt Rico's eyes. He had memorized the layout from Dex's reports, but being here in person felt different. The walls seemed to press in on him, and he could hear the constant hum of machinery, mixed with distant sounds that he tried not to think about too hard. Following the maintenance tunnels, Rico made his way deeper into the complex. The maximum security section was 5 levels below ground, accessible only through a single elevator guarded by automated defense systems. But Rico had a different plan. The ventilation shafts connected every level of the facility, and while they were too small for most people, Rico had always been good at squeezing through tight spaces. The shaft was hot and cramped, filled with the smell of recycled air and industrial chemicals. Rico crawled forward inch by inch, following the building plans he had memorized. Every few minutes, he would pause to listen for sounds of pursuit. But the facility's security forces were still dealing with the communication crisis he had created. When he finally reached the maximum security level, Rico carefully removed the HFY ventilation grate and dropped into an empty storage room. Through the small window in the door, he could see the corridor lined with cell doors. Each one was marked with a number and a small display showing the prisoner's vital signs. Finding cell 47 took longer than expected.
Oh.
The corridor stretched further than Rico had anticipated, and he had to dodge several security patrols along the way. But finally, he stood before the door that held the most dangerous prisoner in the galaxy. The display showed elevated heart rate and brain activity, as if the occupant was awake and alert. The locking mechanism was unlike anything Rico had seen before. Instead of a simple electronic lock, it required biometric scans, voice recognition, and a 12-digit code that changed every hour. But Rico had come prepared. The device he pulled from his pack was a master key of sorts, capable of overriding most Imperial security systems. As the lock clicked open, Rico felt a moment of doubt. He was about to release someone who had reportedly taken hundreds of lives. What if Blake had been wrong? What if this prisoner was too dangerous to set free? But the memory of his mentor's final message pushed him forward. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small cell with metal walls and a single light fixture. And there, sitting calmly on the floor, as if she had been expecting him, was Zara Single Quotes. As first thought was that the descriptions hadn't done her justice. She was indeed 7 feet tall, with crimson skin marked by intricate scars that seemed to tell a story of their own. But her eyes were what caught his attention. They were intelligent and calculating, studying him with the intensity of a predator, evaluating potential prey. "You're either very brave or very stupid human," she said, in accented common tongue. "Both will get you eliminated." Rico swallowed hard and began working on the neural inhibitors wrapped around her head. Devices were more complex than he had expected, with multiple failsafes designed to cause pain if tampered with incorrectly. But his steady hands and years of experience with electronic systems served him well. "I'm probably both," he admitted, as he carefully disconnected the first inhibitor. "But someone thinks you're important enough to risk everything for." Zarathic watched him work with growing interest. "And who might that be?" "Captain Blake Morrison," he said. "You could prevent a catastrophe." The first time since Rico had entered the cell, Zarathic's expression changed. Something that might have been surprise flickered across her features, before disappearing behind her controlled mask. "Blake Morrison," she repeated slowly. "I remember that name. He was there when my people were first enslaved. He tried to help us." Rico successfully removed the neural inhibitors and moved on to the gravity shackles. As each restraint fell away, he could see Zarathic's posture changing. She was still sitting calmly, but there was a new tension in her muscles, like a spring, being slowly released. "Can you walk?" Rico asked, as he removed the final shackle. Zarathic stood up slowly, testing her balance after years of weighted restraints. When she moved, it was with a fluid grace that seemed almost impossible for someone her size. "I can do more than walk," she said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The collar around her neck was the most challenging device to remove. It required delicate work to avoid triggering the explosive charge that would activate if the wrong wire was cut. Rico's hands shook slightly as he worked, aware that one mistake would end both their lives. "Steady," Zarathic said quietly. "Your makes the hands unsteady." I'm not afraid, Rico lied. Yes, you are. But you're doing this anyway. That's what makes you brave. When the collar finally clicked open and fell to the floor, Rico felt like he could breathe again. But their celebration was short-lived. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridor outside, followed by shouted commands and the whine of charging weapons. Time to go, Rico said, pulling a small blaster from his belt and offering it to Zarathic. She looked at the weapon for a moment, then shook her head. I don't need that, she said, picking up one of the heavy shackles that had bound her ankles. I prefer to work with my hands. The first security team burst through the door just as Rico and Zarathic reached the corridor. What happened next would be burned into Rico's memory forever. Zarathic moved like liquid lightning, turning the mining equipment and debris around them into weapons. She didn't just fight the guards, she danced around them, using their own momentum against them. This way, she said, leading Rico through passages he hadn't known existed. I've had 15 years to learn every inch of this place. They fought their way through 3 more security teams, with Zarathic doing most of the work while Rico provided covering fire. But he quickly realized that she wasn't just fighting for freedom, she was fighting with the skill and precision of someone who had been trained for combat from birth. Who are you really? He asked, as they ran through a maintenance tunnel toward the surface. I was a military commander before they enslaved my people, she replied without breaking stride. I know how they think, how they fight, how they can be defeated. They reached Rico's ship just as Imperial reinforcements began arriving from orbit. The Broken Promises engines were already warming up, thanks to the automated systems Rico had activated before entering the facility. But as they lifted off into the toxic atmosphere, Zarathic did something that made Rico's blood run cold. She moved to the navigation console and began entering coordinates for a destination that Rico had never heard of. Where are we going? He asked. The Crimson Nebula, she replied. It's time you learned what you've really gotten yourself into. As the ship jumped to hyperspace, Rico stared at the woman he had just freed and wondered if Blake Morrison had sent him to save the galaxy or destroy it. Either way, there was no turning back now. Rico had seen many strange things during his years of smuggling, but nothing had prepared him for what emerged from the swirling red clouds of the Crimson Nebula. As the Broken Promise dropped out of hyperspace, his jaw fell open at the sight. Before them, thousands of ships filled the space around them, forming a fleet so massive it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Welcome to the Veltar Exodus, Zarathic said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. My people have been gathering here for 30 years, waiting for this moment. Rico stared at the ships surrounding them. They weren't military vessels, but converted cargo haulers, mining ships, and passenger transports. Each one carried the refugees of a civilization that had been scattered across the galaxy. Its families who had been torn apart by slavery were finally coming together again. How many? Rico asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nearly 2 million souls. Zarathic replied. Everyone who survived the conquest of our homeworld. Everyone who managed to escape their masters. Everyone who never gave up hope that we would one day return home. Communication system crackled to life, and voices in the Veltar language filled the ship's bridge. Rico couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion behind them. Joy, relief, and something else that made his skin crawl. Anger that had been building for decades. Zarathic guided their ship toward the center of the fleet, where a massive converted space station served as the command center. As they docked, Rico noticed that every ship they passed was armed. These weren't just refugees, they were an army preparing for war. The docking bay was filled with Veltar warriors, their crimson skin bearing the same ritual scars that marked Zarathic. But as Rico looked closer, he realized that many of the scars were fresh. These people had been hurt recently, and their wounds were still healing. A woman approached them as they disembarked. She was smaller than Zarathic, but carried herself with the same commanding presence. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she embraced her sister. Zara, she said in common tongue for Rico's benefit, I never thought I would see you again. Kira, Zarathic replied, holding her sister tightly. Look at you. You've become everything I hoped you would be. But Rico could sense tension beneath. The reunion. Kira's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and her warriors watched Zarathic with expressions that seemed more cautious than welcoming. We need to talk, Kira said, glancing at Rico. Both of you. The council is waiting. The command center was a converted cargo hold filled with holographic displays showing star charts, fleet positions, and target locations. Rico's blood ran cold as he recognized some of the targets. Proxima Centauri, New Terra, the core worlds. These were civilian population centers with billions of innocent people. The plan is simple, Kira explained, activating a three-dimensional map of Imperial space. We strike 17 worlds simultaneously. The slave markets first, then the administrative centers, and finally, the capital itself. Rico watched in horror as the presentation continued. The Veltar had spent decades planning this operation, studying Imperial defenses, and positioning their people in key locations. It wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a coordinated assault designed to bring down the entire empire. First wave will disable their communication networks, Kira continued. The second wave will target their military installations. The third wave will liberate the slave compounds and processing centers. And the fourth wave? Rico asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Kira's expression hardened. The fourth wave will ensure that no Imperial citizen ever forgets what they allowed to happen to our people. Rico felt sick. He'd expected a rescue operation, maybe some targeted strikes against slave traders. But this was something else entirely. This was genocide disguised as liberation. How many casualties are you expecting? He asked. Casualties are inevitable in any war, Kira replied coldly. The Empire has had 30 years to end slavery voluntarily. It chose not to, now they will face the consequences. Rico looked at Zarathic, hoping to see some sign that she disagreed with her sister's plan. But her expression was unreadable, and when she spoke, her words chilled him to the bone. I've spent 15 years memorizing their security protocols, she said. I know the shift patterns of every major facility, the personal habits of their commanders, the weaknesses in their defense systems. Every day of my captivity was preparation for this moment. The horrifying truth began to sink in. Zarathic hadn't been planning escape attempts during her years of slavery. She had been conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for the massive operation that was about to begin. You used me, Rico said, his voice shaking with anger and betrayal. You let me think I was rescuing you, but you were just waiting for the right moment to return to your fleet. Zarathic turned to face him, and for the first time since he had met her, her mask of control slipped. You freed me from those restraints, Rico. Without you, I would have died in that cell. But yes, I knew this day would come. I knew my people would need me to commit genocide? To claim justice, she corrected. The Empire has enslaved millions of my people. They have worked them to death in mines and factories. They've separated families, destroyed cultures, and treated us like property. How is that any different from what we plan to do to them? Rico wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He had seen the scars on Zarathic's body, heard the pain in her voice when she spoke about her people's suffering. The Empire had committed terrible crimes, but did that justify what the Veltar were planning? There has to be another way, he said finally. You can't save your people by becoming like those who enslaved them, Kira laughed bitterly, spoken like someone who has never been in chains. You humans live in your comfortable ships in space, stations trading with the Empire while ignoring the suffering that built their wealth. You don't get to lecture us about morality. Some of us have been fighting the Empire for years, Rico protested. There are resistance movements, underground networks, people working to change things from within. And how well has that worked? Kira demanded. How many slaves have been freed by your peaceful resistance? How many Veltar children have been returned to their families? Rico couldn't answer. The truth was that his small-scale rescue operations had saved hundreds of people at most. Meanwhile, millions remained in chains throughout Imperial space. The time for half measures is over, Zarathic said quietly.
And my people have waited long?
Enough for freedom. If we don't act now, there may not be a Veltar culture left to save. Over the next several hours, Rico was given a tour of the fleet and introduced to the scope of the operation. The Veltar had infiltrated Imperial society at every level. They had people working in government offices, military installations, and commercial enterprises. Were former slaves who had bought their freedom. Others were sympathizers who had been recruited to the cause. The planning was incredible in its detail and terrifying in its scope. The Veltar knew exactly how to cripple the Empire's ability to respond, how to maximize the psychological impact of their strikes, and how to ensure that their message would be heard across the galaxy. But as Rico listened to the briefings and watched the preparations, he began to understand the true horror of what was about to happen. This wasn't just about freeing slaves or reclaiming the Veltar homeworld. This was about revenge on a scale that would dwarf anything the galaxy had ever seen. The moderate voices among the Veltar leadership had been gradually silenced over the years, replaced by those who saw total war as the only solution. The pain and anger of 30 years of slavery had transformed a proud warrior culture into something darker and more dangerous. As night fell over the fleet, Rico found himself alone on the observation deck of the command station, staring out at the thousands of ships preparing for battle. Tomorrow, the first phase of the operation would begin. Within a week, the galaxy would be at war. He thought about Blake Morrison's final message. It's about preventing a catastrophe. But what catastrophe had his mentor been trying to prevent? The continued existence of slavery, or the genocide that was about to be committed in the name of ending it? Rico realized that he had a choice to make. He could support the Veltar in their quest for freedom, knowing that billions of innocent people would die in the process. Or he could try to stop them, betraying the trust of someone who had become more important to him than he cared to admit. Either way, the blood that was about to be spilled would be partially on his hands. He had freed the key to this entire operation. And now he would have to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. Rico spent 3 sleepless nights trying to find the right words. Every time he approached Zarathic about changing the plan, their conversations turned into heated arguments that left both of them frustrated and angry. Concerns with growing impatience, her jaw tightening with each suggestion he made. "You don't understand what we've been through," she said during their latest discussion in her private quarters. "Every scar on my body tells a story of imperial cruelty. Every night for 15 years, I dreamed of this moment. And now, you want me to show mercy to the people who showed us none?" Rico paced around the small room, running his hands through his hair. "I'm not asking you to show mercy to the slave traders or the guards who hurt you. I'm talking about innocent people who have nothing to do with any of this. Children, families, workers who are just trying to survive." "Innocent?" Zarathic's voice rose. "Where were these innocent people when my children were taken from their parents? Where were they when entire Veltar communities were loaded onto slave ships? Their silence makes them guilty. That's not how justice works," Rico argued. "Can't punish people for crimes they didn't commit. And you can't free a galaxy by asking nicely," she shot back. "We tried peaceful resistance for decades. We sent ambassadors, filed legal protests, appealed to imperial courts. Do you know what happened to them? They disappeared. Every single one." Rico felt like he was talking to a wall. Every logical argument he made was met with painful memories and justified anger. But he couldn't give up. Too many lives hung in the balance. The breaking point came when Rico discovered the final phase of the Veltar plan. Hidden in the classified briefings was a detail that made his blood run cold. The operation included attacking civilian transport ships to prevent evacuations from targeted worlds. "You're planning to target refugee ships," he said, confronting Zarathic in the command center. "Ships full of families trying to escape the fighting. Can't allow the Empire to evacuate their citizens while ours burn," she replied without looking up from her tactical displays. "If they want to save their people, they should surrender unconditionally. Those are innocent people, Zara, children who have never hurt anyone. Children like my nephew, who was worked to death in a factory when he was only 12 years old. Her voice was cold now, colder than Rico had ever heard it. "Children like my daughter, who I will never see again because she was sold to private. Owners who don't keep records?" Rico stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time how much pain she carried. The 15 years of slavery hadn't just scarred her body, they had changed something fundamental inside her. The woman who had once been a protector had become someone who saw the entire galaxy as her enemy. "I can't let you do this," he said quietly. Zarathic finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "How exactly do you plan to stop?" Me. I'll warn them. I'll send messages to the Imperial Navy, to the civilian authorities, to anyone who will listen. No, she said simply. You won't. The guards who appeared behind Rico moved so quietly he hadn't heard them approach. They were Veltar warriors loyal to Zarathic, and their faces showed no emotion as they waited for her command. Take him too. Quarters 7, she ordered. Make sure he's comfortable, but don't let him leave or access any communication systems. As the guards escorted him away, Rico felt a piece of his heart break. The woman he had risked everything to save had just made him a prisoner. But worse than the betrayal was the realization that he had been wrong about her. She wasn't the hero he had imagined. She was someone who had been broken by years of suffering and twisted to something she never meant to become. His new quarters were actually quite comfortable, with a bed, desk, and even a small viewport, showing the stars. But the door was locked from the outside, and when he tried to access the room's communication terminal, he found it had been disabled. For hours, Rico sat by the viewport, watching the Veltar fleet prepare for departure. Supply ships moved between the larger vessels, loading weapons and equipment. Fighter squadrons practiced attack formations. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But Rico had one advantage his captors didn't know about. Of smuggling, he had learned to hide emergency communication devices in the most unlikely places. The one sewn into the heel of his boot was small and had limited range, but it might be enough to reach his network contacts, working carefully too. Avoid detection by any security cameras, Rico managed to extract the device and compose a brief message. He couldn't reveal everything without endangering himself, but he could provide enough information to give the Imperial forces some warning. The message was encrypted and sent to Commander Patricia Reeves of the Imperial Navy, one of the few high-ranking officers who had secretly opposed the slave trade. Rico had worked with her before on small operations to help escaped slaves find safe passage to neutral territories. Patricia, his message began. Massive coordinated attack planned against 17 Imperial worlds. Timeline. Within 72 hours. Targets include civilian population centers. This is not a drill. Evacuation protocols should be implemented immediately. Trust me on this one. Or as he sent the message, Rico knew he was crossing a line he could never uncross. If the Veltar discovered what he had done, they would likely execute him. But if he had done nothing, and billions of people died, he wouldn't have been able to live with himself. The response to his warning came faster than expected. Commander Reeves immediately began mobilizing evacuation fleets and repositioning naval forces. But she also made a decision that horrified Rico when he learned about it later. She authorized preemptive strikes against suspected Veltar positions. The Imperial response was swift and brutal. Warships appeared at the edge of the Crimson Nebula within 18 hours, and their first action was to destroy 3 Veltar refugee ships that were trying to reach neutral space. The crews and passengers of those ships had been families seeking safety, not warriors preparing for battle. When news of the attack reached the Veltar fleet, the reaction was explosive. The moderate voices that had been trying to limit civilian casualties were completely silenced. Even some of Zarathic's advisors who had opposed targeting refugee ships now demanded immediate retaliation. Rico watched the aftermath of his warning from his locked quarters, feeling sick as he realized what he had done. His attempt to prevent innocent deaths had actually caused them. The Imperial forces, faced with the threat of coordinated attacks, struck first at the most vulnerable targets they could find. Zarathic came to see him that evening, her face showing exhaustion and something that might have been regret. You sent a message, she said. It wasn't a question, as Rico admitted. There was no point in lying now. 3 ships full of families are dead because of your warning. Children, elders, people who had never held a weapon in their lives. Rico felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. I was trying to save lives, not take them. The road to destruction is paved with good intentions, she said quietly. I learned that lesson a long time ago. What happens now? Zarathic was quiet for a long moment, staring out the viewport at the stars. Now we fight. Your empire has shown us that they prefer total war to negotiated peace. So be it. They're not my empire, Rico protested. I've been fighting against them for years. Yet when the moment came to choose sides, you chose them over us. Rico wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. In trying to find a middle path, he had made everything worse. The moderate elements in both the Veltar resistance and the Imperial command structure had been overwhelmed by extremists who saw only enemies, not people. As Zarathic turned to leave, Rico called out to her. It doesn't have to be this way. There's still time to find another solution. She paused at the door, her hand on the control panel. Time ran out 30 years ago when they enslaved my people. It ran out 15 years ago when they put those restraints on me. It ran out yesterday when they decided to attack refugee ships rather than listen to warnings about their own civilians. And what about us? Rico asked. What about what we meant to each other? For just a moment, her mask slipped and he saw the pain in her eyes. We were a beautiful dream, Rico, but dreams don't survive in the real world. After she left, Rico sat alone in his quarters, watching the Veltar fleet prepare for a war that would consume the galaxy. His actions had helped to start something that might never end. And he would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. Outside his viewport, the first attack formations were already moving toward the edge of the nebula. Within hours, the shooting would begin, and there would be no turning back for anyone involved. Rico closed his eyes and tried to remember what Blake Morrison had said about preventing a catastrophe. But now he wasn't sure which catastrophe his mentor had been trying to prevent, the genocide the Veltar were planning, or the war that Rico himself had helped to start. 6 months later, the galaxy was burning. Rico watched from his quarters as reports flooded in from across Imperial space. The Veltar had struck exactly as planned, hitting 17 worlds simultaneously. But the Empire's response had been just as devastating. Entire star systems had become battlefields where no one remembered who had fired the first shot. The war that both sides thought they could win quickly had turned into a nightmare of mutual destruction. Veltar liberation forces freed millions of slaves, but Imperial retaliation destroyed refugee camps and supply convoys. Imperial forces protected their civilian populations, but their scorched earth tactics left entire planets uninhabitable. Rico had become an unwilling witness to the consequences of his choices. The Veltar kept him alive partly because Zarathic still felt something for him, and partly because his knowledge of Imperial smuggling routes had proven useful. But mostly, he suspected, they kept him around as a reminder of how good intentions could lead to terrible outcomes. The final confrontation came when both fleets met in the space above Velcaris, the ancient homeworld of Zarathic's people. The planet had been an Imperial stronghold for 30 years, its surface covered with military installations and slave processing centers. For the Veltar, reclaiming it represented everything they had fought for. For the Empire, losing it would mean the collapse of their entire slave-based economy. Rico was brought to the command bridge to watch the battle unfold. The sight before him was both beautiful and terrifying. Thousands of ships from both sides formed battle lines that stretched across the horizon. The Veltar fleet included everything from converted cargo haulers to stolen Imperial warships. The Imperial force was smaller but more heavily armed, with massive dreadnoughts that could destroy entire squadrons with a single volley. "This is it," Zarathic said, standing beside him at the main view screen. 30 years of planning, 6 months of war, and it all comes down to this moment. Rico studied her face, looking for any sign of the woman he had fallen in love with during their idyll. Escape. But the months of warfare had changed her even more. The scars on her arms had been joined by new ones from recent battles. Her eyes held a hardness that seemed to have consumed whatever gentleness had once existed there. "It doesn't have to end this way," he said quietly. "Even now, you could open negotiations. Find a way to stop the killing? Negotiations?" Kira's voice cut through their conversation like a blade. Zarathic's sister had become the fleet's war leader, and her hatred for the Empire burned brighter than any star. They had 30 years to negotiate. They chose slavery instead. "And now they're choosing total war," Rico replied. "How many more people have to die before someone decides enough is enough?" "All of them, if necessary." Kira said coldly. Every Imperial citizen who ever benefited from our suffering, every guard who ever raised a hand against our people, every politician who ever voted to maintain the slave trade. Rico felt a chill run down his spine. The woman speaking wasn't just planning to win a war, she was planning to commit genocide on a scale the galaxy had never seen. But before anyone could respond, something unexpected happened. A new signal appeared on the communication console, transmitted on an open frequency that both fleets could hear. The voice that emerged was tired but determined. "This is Commander Patricia Reeves of the Imperial Navy. I am speaking without authorization from my superiors. My career is probably over after this message. But I can't watch any more people die for a system that should have ended decades ago." Rico's heart skipped a beat. Patricia was risking everything by making this broadcast. "I have seen the reports from our intelligence division," she continued. "I know what my government has been hiding from our citizens. The slave trade isn't just a distant problem in the Outer Rim. It's the foundation of our entire economy. I can no longer serve a system built on the suffering of innocent people." The bridge fell silent as everyone listened to her words. Even Kira's expression had changed from anger to surprise. "I am hereby ordering my fleet to stand down and withdraw from Velcara's system. Any Imperial officer who wishes to join me in opposing this immoral war is welcome to do so. Any who choose to continue fighting will do so without my support." Rico watched in amazement as nearly half the Imperial fleet began pulling back from their battle formations. Ships that had been preparing to unleash destruction on the Veltar forces instead powered down their weapons and activated peaceful running lights. But the remaining Imperial ships, commanded by hardline officers who saw surrender as treason, opened fire on both the retreating vessels and the Veltar fleet. The space around Velcaris erupted into chaos as three separate forces began fighting each other. "Now," Zarathic said quietly, while they're confused and divided. She moved to the tactical station and began issuing orders to the Veltar fleet. But instead of ordering an all-out attack, she did something that surprised everyone on the bridge. All ships target military installations only. Civilian evacuation routes are to remain clear. Any commander who fires on non-combatant vessels will answer to me personally." Kira spun around to face her sister, fury blazing in her eyes. "What are you doing? This is our chance to finish them once and for all? This is our chance to prove we're better than they are," Zarathic replied firmly. "We're liberators, not conquerors. We fight to free our people, not to become the monsters they claimed we were." The argument that followed tore through the Veltar. Command structure like a storm. Kira and her supporters demanded total war, while Zarathic insisted on restraint. For a terrifying moment, Rico thought the Veltar might start fighting each other instead of their enemies, but Zarathic's reputation and the respect of the older commanders carried the day. The Veltar attack proceeded, but with surgical precision. Instead of blind revenge, they targeted slave compounds, weapons factories, and military bases while leaving civilian areas untouched. Rico found himself in an unexpected position as the battle raged around them. Commander Reeves contacted the Veltar flagship directly, requesting permission to coordinate evacuation efforts with their forces. Both sides needed someone they could trust to serve as an intermediary, and somehow that person turned out to be him. "You know both fleets?" Zarathic said as she authorized him to handle the communications. "You understand what we're fighting for, and you've seen the cost of this war. Help us find a way to end it without destroying everything we're trying to save." For the next 18 hours, Rico worked frantically to coordinate the most complex military operation in galactic history. Veltar Liberation Forces would secure the slave compounds and processing centers while Imperial rebels provided safe passage for evacuating civilians. The hardline Imperial forces found themselves fighting a two-front war they couldn't win. The turning point came when a group of freed Veltar prisoners joined the evacuation efforts, helping Imperial civilians escape the fighting. The sight of former slaves risking their lives to save their former oppressors was broadcast across the galaxy, and public opinion began to shift dramatically. Within a week, the Imperial government collapsed, not from military defeat, but from the loss of public support as citizens learned the truth about the slave trade that had funded their comfortable lives. The new government's first act was to officially abolish slavery throughout imperial space and begin negotiations with the Veltar leadership. Rico stood on the observation deck of the Broken Promise, watching as Veltar and imperial ships worked together to establish refugee camps and medical stations around Velcaris. The planet's surface was scarred by years of exploitation, but already there were signs of recovery as freed slaves began the long process of rebuilding their civilization. Strange how things worked out, Zarathik said, joining him at the viewport. She looked different now, older, more tired, but somehow more at peace than she had been in months. Is it over? Rico asked. The war is over, she replied. But the real work is just beginning. 30 years of slavery doesn't end overnight. There are millions of people who need help rebuilding their lives. And not everyone on either side is ready to forgive and move forward. Rico nodded, understanding what she meant. There were still hardliners among both the Veltar and the former imperial territories who preferred revenge to reconciliation. The peace they had won was fragile and would require constant protection. Happens to us? He asked. Zarathik was quiet for a long moment, watching as a medical ship arrived to treat wounded from both sides. I don't know, she admitted. We've both changed so much. It's the war, the choices we made, the things we did to each other. I'm not sure we can go back to what we were. Maybe we don't go back, Rico suggested. Maybe we move forward, together. Shh. Turned to look at him, and for the first time in months, he saw something in her eyes that looked like hope. The Outer Rim territories are full of places where the old laws don't apply anymore. There are probably slave traders who think they can continue operating now that the Empire has fallen. Probably, Rico agreed. Someone should do something about that. Someone should, she said with the hint of a smile. Are you interested in the job? Rico looked out at the stars, thinking about Blake Morrison's final message and the long journey that had brought them to this moment.